Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Howard Shore, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's impossible to create something like Middle-earth with a pen unless you're J.R.R. Tolkien or Howard Shore. And that's how he works. He has a pen to create harmony and counterpoint, and he has ink to do the arrangement. So it's all done as it used to be done in the 19th century. And if you were present yesterday in the beautiful concert, then you've seen what it leads to. Just this beauty of musicians playing together in an orchestra as it was created way back in the 19th century by the likes of Beethoven and Richard Wagner. And maybe I can start with a question about Richard Wagner, just as it comes to my mind, because The Lord of the Rings follows the technique of the leitmotif, but expands it in a way that even Wagner, I think, wouldn't have managed to do that.
A lot of my experience actually with storytelling wasn't using leitmotifs. And when I worked with Cronenberg, actually, we're doing the opposite of the way I worked with Peter Jackson. With Cronenberg, I'm working around the frame. We're not trying to express or illustrate any of the ideas in the script. We're purposely leaving things up to you, up to the audience to interpret and create their own ideas of what's being presented in the films. Where with Lord of the Rings, working with Peter Jackson, early on, first thing we started on was the Mines of Moria. And I started with the Fellowship entering the mine and walking that first scene. And I worked on that over and over with Peter to express the right ideas. And I quickly realized that the Cronenberg techniques that I had used for years were not going to work with Lord of the Rings. Everything had to be very illustrative of the story, because it's a fantastically complex story. One of the most complex books ever written, really, for fantasy, for a fantasy world. So realizing that in the beginning, I started to work on motifs and themes. And it was, Doug Adams wrote a book about it called The Music of the Lord of the Rings Films. And he describes over 100 leitmotifs and themes in the film.
I think 180 he counted, 180 leitmotifs, he said, if I remember it correctly. Isn't it?
I can't.
180, he says, as many as
180,
I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know he had over 100.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm wrong, but it was.
As I wrote, I kept collecting ideas and developing them. So I didn't start out with a grand plan. I just worked. It was a day-to-day process. The score took about 4 years to write, and I orchestrated it in as well in ink. I wrote the compositions in pencil. I learned to write with pencil when I was a child. I had a teacher who gave me clarinet lessons and taught me to write counterpoint and harmony with a pencil. And so all my scores are compositionally all written in pencil, and then I orchestrated it in ink. The reason I use ink is that it had better flow than the pencil. And I didn't develop so much carpal tunnel problems with my right hand. So the ink allowed me to be a little more fluid and working on the orchestrations.
So your original handwritten scores must be very beautiful to look at. Do they go to a museum or something?
But the Wagner, the idea of using leitmotifs worked well with the Ring de Nibelung and also with the story of the Ring, although Tolkien said that his story had nothing to do with the Wagner story, and they were connected. But Ring mythology has been around for a long time. It predates both the Wagner work and the Tolkien work. And once you go back into the history of ring mythology, there's a whole world of study to investigate. So I used the motifs to describe the story, and once I did that, you were kind of in that process of that illustrative process of trying to understand things like the character, an elf character, was he from, was it Rivendell, or was it Lothlorien? And so the music helped to express the ideas in the story. It was used for clarity of storytelling.
Can we just show one scene from Lord of the Rings, just to remember how beautiful it is? Some people say Wagner himself created the cinema because he turned off the light in the theater and had this totality of sensual attractions. And I think this is what you bring back. When the silent movie days ended, people said, well, how can such a beautiful thing end? But you bring it back, this excitement of having a live orchestra play. It's almost like hearing a live orchestra. It's so vivid what you do with this score, in my opinion. And if you see the images. Well, this is my question. I mean, since you read this book in the 60s, when everybody read it, when you were on tour with your band, Lighthouse, what was it like? You were sitting on a bus and imagining. Did you imagine music when you read that book? Some people do that.
Yeah, I wrote music, when I was really young. I learned to write, as I was saying, with a pencil. So I was writing counterpoint and harmony, and I was writing small compositions at an early age, but also trying to make a living really as a woodwind player. I was playing clarinet, flute, and saxophones. So, but the idea of what I was wanting to do wasn't so much about films, it was more about recording. And film music is really a recorded art form. And so I wanted to be in the studio recording new music, and film was a perfect way for me to enter that world.
This is something that you imagined as a child when you were 8 years old and your mother bought you a clarinet. Were you imagining already?
I was trying to figure out how to create that sound. Like if I listened to Charles Mingus or Duke Ellington, I found myself constantly trying to listen inside the recordings as to how the harmony was voiced, what the sounds were inside the recording. How do you create those sounds? And I realized that what I was really looking for was the visual art of composition, of looking at the page visually. And film music allowed me a way into the world of working with great orchestra, with great soloists, and really great recording studios. So that was my interest, trying to figure out how the music was created.
It's amazing. You mentioned Charlie Mingus or these great jazz musicians who were like Ornette Coleman, who I think is of some influence
Naked
to you.
Lunch, yeah.
Yes, yes.
I collaborated with Ornette Coleman on Naked Lunch.
If you were in the audience yesterday, there was a beautiful recreation of that solo.
Great sax player.
Great sax player.
Last night,
It's wonderful to listen to that. And but you mentioned these avant-garde jazz musicians who were aiming for much more than just having a jazz band playing some standards, So you were already interested in something that's more than one genre of music. And I think this is what your music is so famous for, that you can adapt to anything, even to avant-garde, atonal music.
Yeah.
That's all included. So there's nothing alien to you. Nothing is...
Yeah. I was listening to everything. I mean, I was listening to Takemitsu, the electronic recordings especially, and his film music, concert music. I was interested in jazz because I like the idea of improvisation. I like the idea of expressing ideas musically through improvisation. And I use that free association with imagery and storytelling with improvisation. The first thing I'm reacting to when I see a new film is emotionally how I connect to it, and then I try to improvise on the emotion to create pieces.
Can I compare this to abstract painting? You know, my partner is a painter, and she composes and she improvises at the same time because she fills a canvas with color. Is that similar to how you compose music?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm, is that yes? I would like to, before we start to talk about, I think, David Cronenberg, which is, I think, in my opinion, the most important musical collaboration between a director and a composer in film history. It's the most elaborate one. You know, Bernard Herrmann wrote 9 scores for Hitchcock. Danny Elfman, I counted 13 scores for Tim Burton. But there's nothing like your collaboration with David Cronenberg. I know we're talking about it already. This is like, to me, it's an ongoing work. It's like it's one piece that's developing. Like his work comes from, you know, one idea and develops even further and further and further. Do you see it like that? Could we perform all your Cronenberg scores at a festival? Like we can go to Bayreuth and perform it there instead of the Wagner operas, just like one series of work. Because I think it's
different directors have different ways of working with composers. And I've worked with some great directors who don't get too involved in the music making. They like to work with me, I think, on a very open type of work, because remembering that in the final dub, the director has the final say. So it's good. It's smart in a way to have the composer have a lot of freedom, because he might express ideas that are at the heart of the film and bring out a lot of the storytelling that are really essential to the success of the film.
Because this is a question that always comes up when talking about music and film. Many directors don't have a clue about music. That's what composers like to say. And the usual answer is, how can I tell you unless I hear it? So people have to come up with something. And if they don't come up with something, then there's already the temp track that gives an idea of something and, you know, limits the focus of the future composer who has to match the temp track or something. So did you have experiences like that with directors who couldn't tell you what they want?
Yeah, they don't tell you what they want. They more express their ideas through the making of the film. With David Cronenberg, we have very little discussion about the music. We've been working together for 17 films now. So it's a very intuitive process with him. He lets me do pretty much everything I want to try in the film. Sometimes we work together at the very end, editing, you know, doing some slight editing, but mostly it's everything I've written in the film. David Fincher, the same, very generous, allowed me a lot of creative freedom in movies like Seven and Panic Room, The Game. With Scorsese, he's very music oriented, and it's a lot of fun working with him because he knows so much about the subject, and how to use music in film is really unique. So that's a really wonderful collaborative relation. And you know, I'm so happy, you know, to have had directors allowed me a lot of freedom in what I was doing.
They can be even more happy to have you. Can we just watch a scene, a small scene from After Hours? You have 1 minute that you brought with you from After Hours, please. I love this so much, maybe because it's so much like the Cronenberg films, the Scorsese film. It's so surreal. Was that the clavinova that you used? Or
It was what?
the clavinova or clavichord? What was this electronic instrument that you
I
used?
can't really understand you.
The electronic instrument that you used for that film?
Yeah. After Hours is essentially an all-electronic score. I had a studio in the Brill Building in New York, 49th and Broadway, a very famous building, and I met Griffin Dunn, who's the star of this film, in the elevator of the building, and he introduced me to Scorsese, who was cutting in the building with Thelma Schoonmaker, and I was creating these pieces electronically, all with rented generators and rented equipment. I did have the Synclavier, a fantastically powerful digital computer. And I was working with that and creating these little loopy type of things that you just heard. And then I'd meet with Marty and Thelma, and we'd kind of put them in the film and then have a listen. I'd create a few more, try them in different places in the film. So it was a very organic process, creating these electronic pieces and working with Scorsese carefully in the Brill Building. This was all in 1986. 86, I wrote this score, and I wrote a score to the film The Fly with David Cronenberg. And I also did a film with Penny Marshall called Big, all in the same year. And they were all successful films. And then I was offered so many different types of films because of that, because of this range. And I just tried a lot of different things. I went from working with Fincher to doing Mrs. Doubtfire and things like that, So I really tried to do a lot of different things just for the interest in music, try to express different ideas.
And you were very well prepared to do all these different styles somehow.
Come, because I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
So you must have been very well prepared. To come up with all these different styles to fill, into all these demands that were.
Yeah. Well, After Hours was a score I recorded and played everything myself. I didn't do too many of those scores, but it's interesting that the last score I did, The Shrouds, I did the same technique. I created all the electronic pieces and played them all. Personally played them. So The Shrouds and After Hours are really, this piece that you just heard, are connected, and that's over a course of about 40 years. Yeah.
Once you described your technique as dream and research, or research and dream. Maybe it's the other way around. You research and then you go to sleep and dream about, and then you start composing. Is that
Well,
right?
I try to get in touch with my inner feelings, the subtext. So I think that's all part of the dream. And if you think of films, you go into a dark room, the lights change, it becomes dark, and imagery start appearing. So you're in a kind of dreamlike stage, and I like to use that idea when I write music for film. So I'm trying to express inner feelings that I have about the subject. And there is some dreaming involved in it, some napping, and you're trying to be very relaxed and trying to imagine what the piece could be. And then I set to work with my pencil, creating the actual score to the to what I'm dreaming, so it can be performed either electronically or with a group, a chamber orchestra, or a symphony orchestra. But the process is all the same.
It reminds me so much of the way Luis Buñuel worked, the director, because I met his son once, and he said in the hours around noon we couldn't disturb him. He was working because he was sleeping at that time. He was working in his sleep, inventing all his creations.
Right.
It sounds exactly like your work. Something that's very close to dream is horror, and I'd like to show a clip from The Silence of the Lambs, just right.
Sure. Skip Livesey did the sound design. It's really beautiful. I think this showcases the sound design and the music working together. And Skip and I did a lot of the pre-mixing of the film with sound effects and music. Really sound design he created and music. And we worked together very closely on it before we even showed it to Jonathan, the director, which I think is really kind of an unusual aspect, for working on films. I recommend that. I also wanted to mention that in the first scene we saw with Lord of the Rings, that the score to Lord of the Rings was started in New Zealand. And the first recordings were done in Town Hall in Wellington, New Zealand, with the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra. And there was nowhere to mix the film. So we had to go to a government created these sound mixing rooms for film. There were government rooms. And the one that I mixed in had a very unusual shape. It was shaped like an old-time sort of coffin shape, where it was bigger at the back and narrower at the front. And that design was where we mixed the music. And we did something really unusual. We created the whole design of the film, the 5.1 imagery, all within the room, just with the music. And we created the music and the ambience first, and then we put the film into that, which is almost the opposite way that most film is done. Most film is done with the imagery created and then the sound being applied to the imagery. We did the exact opposite, and by doing that, we actually created the whole imagery of the film. So when you see those big scenes in the cinema, like this scene from that we showed at the beginning, that's how they were created. And I think that gave it this great expanse, this beautiful imagery for the screen.
Yeah, these gunshots almost like percussion sounds, like if they were composed, in my opinion. The way the sound adds to the music by contrast. And for example, this scene is so full of beauty, and that comes from the music. The harmonies are still harmonies. They're very beautiful. So they create a sublime quality associated with death. So, and again, it's very Wagnerian, in my opinion. Makes you think that death is a beautiful thing, or not that bad at all, in my opinion.
At the end of Return of the King, I wrote a piece. It was the very last thing you hear on the soundtrack, which was like sort of the tip of the hat to Wagner, like for thanking you for the idea of the use of leitmotifs in storytelling.
Yes, I mean, you help the storytelling with your music by the use of leitmotifs. And on the other hand, you mentioned once that sometimes you don't even look at the film scene, you just listen to the sounds that were recorded, and then develop your composition from the sounds, from the actual sounds.
I do that a lot when I'm writing, when I'm actually scoring the film, because what I'm doing is creating pieces about the scene and deciding what motifs I want to use in the scene. But when I actually start to work on placing the compositional ideas into the score, into the film, directly, I don't study the film so much as I kind of listen to it. I listen to the rhythm of the actors and how they're expressing the ideas. I can listen to the sound effects and how they're going to be used in the film. So sometimes I write with just the sound of the film and not the visualization of it. I kind of imagine the visualization of it. So I'm writing to this more abstract idea in my mind of what the scene is about and what ideas I want to express to the audience.
Yes, and for example, your scores often show so much respect for the dialogue, as if that was music too, like in an opera.
Yes.
Can you explain about that too?
Well, important, and I was using the Tolkien languages. It was an idea that I worked on with Philippa Boyens. she was an expert in Tolkien's languages, and so she helped me very carefully to using Sindarin and Quenya and Black speech, and it was a way of putting back into this music these ideas that Tolkien had in the book. And it was a way to take his poetry and his song lyrics and put them back into the film. And I think it gave it much more depth. It broadened the emotional response that audiences had to the film by using Tolkien's languages.
I also think that this is what makes the film last forever, because you can watch it forever, because you can listen to the music forever, in my opinion. I think this is, if you look at old Hollywood films, the Disney films, for example, what would they be without their music? Would we watch them time and time after again, you know? And do you think that your music helps the films like outlive their present life and live forever?
What did you want?
Do you think that your music helps films to you know, live forever, to be watchable over and over again?
Well, yeah, possibly. I mean, I'm trying to express the ideas in the film in music. I'm trying to take the imagery and create something in an audio world that expresses those ideas. That's my goal.
Let's just show one scene from a Cronenberg film, from Crash, which has such a wonderful score. Just another.
Thank you. I did a film with Cronenberg just before this film called M. Butterfly. And in that score, I used the London Philharmonic and 2 acoustic harps. First time I had written for 2 harps, and I placed them left and right of the podium. And for this film, what I was doing was I was just expanding that harp composition to 3 harps, which became left, center, right, which is the mixing scenario for creating surround sound in the theater. And with left, center, right, I put each harp, left, center, right, 3 harps, and then I used 2 electric guitars playing an octave higher than the harps on each of the 3 parts, and created some electronic, no, I didn't use any electronics actually. It's all done live, but there was quite a bit of editing done, selecting things that I was interested in. But the addition were 3 woodwind players and 2 percussionists playing all metal percussion. So it's a 14-piece group. And that became the way I structured this piece, all played live in the studio.
And again, the sensual quality of the sound of metal is like visual art to me. It's like a painter at work, because you get a sense of the material and at the same time a sense of the milieu, of the strange subculture that's happening here. You know, these crazy guys recreating the deaths of famous people. But again, you're taking into this subconscious world, and that all works through the sensuality of the sound.
Yeah, I'm creating the pieces away from the film, and then I'm in a second part of the work trying to figure out how the music fits into the film. And I recommend that to other composers. Like, don't start scoring the film, just create a body of work based on your ideas about the subject, and then figure out how to place those ideas into the film. And you'll come up with some really wonderful collaborations between yourself and the nature of the film. Like this scene that we just saw, I didn't score that scene. I took a piece of music that I had and I shaped it and put it into that scene using various editing techniques or or creating different tempos to the piece, different orchestrations, but I'm creating the music first and then putting it into the film.
Do directors sometimes get jealous of you?
Well, you can. The thing with film music that's so powerful is that you can whisper to the audience. You can create things. You could have a dialogue with the audience that the director sometimes is not even aware of. So, because you're talking to them in certain ways. You're using music in the film, and I've had phone calls from directors. This was more early on in my career, where directors would call me after the film was out, and been playing for like a couple weeks, and they'd say, "Oh, I get that now. I understand what you were doing. I didn't understand that in the beginning, but I went with it. But now I see what you were trying to create." So they weren't always necessarily aware of what was going on, and sometimes I wasn't always aware of it either. I was just trying to do my job, do my work, and score this film, but I was doing it in ways that were maybe unusual to the way that people worked.
It's so interesting about the perception of image and music. People like to see it together and find the similarities. They don't actually are that easily being distracted by opposites. That's my experience when I play piano for silent movies. People like to have these things go together.
Right.
So the dissonances, they don't mind that much, the dissonances. They like to see, it's like reading a horoscope. You see what fits to your own life when you read it.
Right.
But on the other hand, sometimes they don't see the radical otherness of one of these pieces. What is your opinion about that? About the conflict of having opposite art forms playing at the same time?
Right. I don't know if I can comment on that.
May I put it some other way? Sometimes there's a competition. Who wins? Who is more important, the image or the music? Do you sometimes feel that there's a competition?
Well, I don't think it's a competition, but the director is the most control. That's what I was saying earlier. Like the director has the principal control from the film dubbing, can decide to leave the music in the film, take it out, lower it, how they mix it, how they treat it is really in the world of the director, not the composer.
Or even the producers sometimes. Now we're speaking about the dark side of your profession. There are composers being fired from a movie. I hope this never happened to you.
I didn't work with a lot of producers. I don't know. I was mostly working with directors, and occasionally I would have influences that would get to me from production, but mostly it was directors in that period that I worked in. It might be a little different now. Mm-hmm.
Maybe because you met David Cronenberg as a youngster and you saw there was some avant-garde filmmaker at work who was doing what he wanted, who was in control. Was this something that you took as a kind of given, that you would only work with directors who are that powerful as artists?
Well, that was the most fun, to work with directors that were creating their own world. I did a film with Tim Burton, Ed Wood, and he created this wonderful atmosphere to working on his film where you couldn't do anything wrong. Everything was accepted, and it was a very creative process. Fantastic. A lot of fun.
It's one of my favorites because it makes so much beautiful fun of the way the old films in the 50s, were using avant-garde instruments and electronic sounds and the theremin or these things. It's like and of course it's unique. I mean, how did you manage to get this job and not Danny Elfman?
You're talking about Ed Wood?
Yes.
I don't know. He actually I had asked Henry Mancini to work on the film, but he got ill. And I came in kind of at the last minute and worked on the score. And it was a fabulous collaboration. I love the film. Yeah.
Now I'm imagining Henry Mancini music to it. What a very, very strange film that would have been.
But Danny Elfman has done fantastic work with Tim Burton, which I've seen a lot of those films. So they've had a great collaboration, which continues now to this day. It's great.
Do we have questions to the great master? Yeah, there's one, and we have a microphone that's coming to you. Well, maybe you can have my microphone that's even quicker. No, we cannot interfere with the other profession.
Hello, hello. All right. Howard, do you hear me? Yeah. Thanks for joining us today. You have so many achievements, rewards in your life. Do you have any dreams or goals that you want to achieve after such a great life?
No, not really. I mean, I've been honored so much in so many ways. Most of my days at this point are in the vault. You know, I'm in the archive, and I'm releasing music. Sometimes that's never actually been released yet. So things are on the way. Deutsche Grammophon is doing a beautiful release of the concerts I did in Paris last year. And that has beautiful performances on it, all from film.
That was a nice question. Thank you. Over there.
I'm a huge fan of your work on Lord of the Rings, especially, and I was wondering does your work on the Fellowship of the Ring, for example, influence your work on the other two movies? Do you see it as an evolution, a progress of work, or do you go about each film as at a clean slate, as a new project in terms of music?
No, well, with Lord of the Rings, I mean, the book was written as one piece. Because of the scarcity of paper after the war, it was released as a 3-part trilogy. But it's really created as one story, and I approached it as one story. And I knew at some point I'd have to write The Destruction of the Ring. I couldn't imagine writing it when I was working on Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first film. But eventually, as I wrote my way through Two Towers, I eventually got to The Destruction of the Ring. And then one night I just wrote it. It just came so from being so much into the story. And I kind of wrote my way into the story, and Peter was doing the same thing when he was creating the film. I always imagined it like we were holding up lanterns in the dark, and he'd lead the way, and I'd follow him, and then sometimes I'd put the lantern up, and he'd follow me. So we were supporting each other and trying to tell this story as truthfully as we could. And that was our goal, to be as loyal to the book and to Tolkien as we could. And I think that's partly partly the success of the film, was that we put so much heart and soul into it to tell the story from our hearts, from how much people appreciated this particular book that Tolkien had written.
Yes, please.
Hello, and thank you for your beautiful work. Last year you announced that you would take action against Star Entertainment's illegal Lord of the Ring concerts, and I'm actually very pleased to hear that, as it's not of good quality and the working conditions for musicians are said to be catastrophic. At the same time, the demand for film music live concerts, even without the movie being shown, seems to be greater than ever. Are you planning to counter this with more official concerts, or how would you explain the ever-growing popularity of your soundtrack, and does it still honor you? And maybe just one little bonus question, would there be any chance that you might sign my actually pretty official vinyl afterwards?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I tried to be as careful with the live performances, and actually, I work with a man named, excuse me, I work with a man named Alan Frey, and he makes sure that every conductor is well versed in the scores, that all the soloists are soloists that we've approved, and we only work with orchestras that are very carefully vetted to use our rehearsal times and techniques. So whatever goes out, I tried to, in the last 20 years, make as good as it could possibly be. I was very careful not to let the music be played badly. So I've always tried to attain this high standard, and I think that's what gave it a lot of energy and kept it going so well. Yeah.
Thank you. So, yeah, there's another question over there, and after you. Over here. Maybe I'm quicker now. This time I'm quicker.
So I have a question. Did any one of you know, like when you worked on the movies, Lord of the Rings, did any one of you ever expect it to be so big? Because like I don't think there's any movies that are so famous 20 years after the making.
Did you get the question? Yeah. The question was, did anybody expect this to be that big? Okay.
Are you talking about the Rings
Yes,
films?
yes.
I guess some people may have, because Bob Shea, who was the executive at New Line, who gave the green light to it, he said, why not do 3 films? So he must have felt that could be that successful. But we all knew that if Fellowship of the Ring wasn't successful, that would be very difficult to make 2 Towers and Return of the King. So once Fellowship of the Ring was successful, both critically and at the box office, and won some honors as well, we just took off from there. And so we made 2 Towers, even, we just continued on the course very carefully, and the budgets weren't decreasing, they were increasing. It was just like, do your best work. I'd never really worked on a film where the studio and the executives were saying, just do this as well as you possibly can. And they were so supportive that if I felt I could do something better than what I had already recorded, I could go back into the studio and redo it. Time was the enemy, not budget. It was like, how can you do this as well as possible in the time that you have?
Are these working conditions that will continue to exist?
Not really. I mean, I think it was a really rare process making that films. And I mean, we set out to make these classic films. We did. We wanted them to be as great as they possibly could be. And we worked on them tirelessly for years and years, creating them to be as great as we could make them.
Can you imagine a world where some artificial intelligence is doing these things?
It would be great.
I don't think so. You say that because it's way past our lives, but it won't be great. How can it be great? Okay. There was one question. There was one in the back, and I'm running.
Daniel?
Yeah.
I have one question up here.
Okay. So, but this gentleman has been asking to ask for quite some time.
Hi. Okay. Hi. Thank you very much. Yes, I will stand up. You talked about how your approach to music with Cronenberg was different from the ones with Peter Jackson, for example. Can you describe your process with Cronenberg, please? The process of writing music with Cronenberg.
It's all very intuitive. We've been working on films together since the late 70s. And, you know, we're big fans of movies and movie making, and David just allows me to read the scripts as soon as he finishes them. So I have the words. I like to work with the words quite a bit. I like to read. So the words are very important, the script. And I start imagining the music from the script. And then when I have the imagery, it's like the next step, like a booster step. And then you go into that, once you see the imagery, you start creating pieces based on the imagery and your emotions of seeing those scenes. But the process with David is very intuitive. We don't talk very much. We spot the movie. We spend a day just going through it and deciding where music goes. We don't always stick to that. We change things right up to the end of the dub. But we're good partners. He's very generous, and he's very open to experimental ideas. We've done things like, even the early films like The Brood, Scanners, and Videodrome, all kind of experimental and using electronics in a very unusual way, using the orchestra in a very unusual way. The Fly was very symphonic. We've tried different ways of using music to tell stories in film. You know, we didn't stick with one technique. We kept trying different things, and that, I think, kept the energy going and kept it interesting.
Thank you. The very last question is still reserved for the gentleman over there, sorry.
Hello, Mr. Shore. You've worked with some of the greatest directors in the industry, like Fincher.
Hard to hear you.
I'm sorry. You've worked with some of the greatest directors in the industry, like Scorsese, Fincher, Peter Jackson, Cronenberg, the list goes on. What I'm wondering is, who's one director you would have loved to work with but never had the chance to? Thank you.
Maybe Orson Welles.
Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock, Johnny Chaplin. Well, he wrote his own music.
Hitchcock would be great too, sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for sharing all this. We've learned so much.
Thank you.
And congratulations on winning the award today.